and I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to, and I will make room for you to do whatever you want to do whatever you want to.
Lord, you are King, and you get to decide what we do today. Lord, I ask that you would do whatever you want to in our hearts, whatever you want to in my heart. And we ask, Father, that you would get all the glory. And that we would bring you the sacrifice of praise you deserve. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Have you ever been on a journey that didn't make sense? I mean, you know you're going in the direction God has said, but every step feels heavier than the last. You know that you're walking in obedience, but it doesn't feel like victory. In fact, the deeper you go, the farther you walk, the less that you understand. Eventually, it feels you're not running, obviously. You might barely be walking. But over time, it feels more like you're dragging yourself forward. You're obeying, but you're aching in the process. That is Abraham in Genesis 22. Turn there if you would, Genesis 22. And there we see that Abraham gets a call from God, an invitation, not to celebrate, but to sacrifice. God asks for the thing most precious to him in his whole world, his son, the one he's been waiting a lifetime for. No explanation, no details, just go. Go to this mountain that I'll show you, and there sacrifice your son. This isn't the kind of journey that we want to post about on social media. This is the quiet, painful, faith-stretching kind. And yet it's in these moments that God reveals what's really going on in our hearts. It's where we learn something that we wish we never needed to learn, but afterwards we look back and we say, this is true. That God tests our faith, asking us to take heavy steps, not to break us, but to strengthen us. Let me say that again. God tests our faith by asking us to take heavy steps, not to break us, but to strengthen us. Maybe that's you. Maybe you're showing up, you're doing the right things, you're heading in the right direction, but each step forward feels harder than the last. It feels like walking uphill with no end in sight, like you're trusting God, but also wondering if He's leading you into heartbreak. Today, I want to talk to the ones who are still walking, even when it's hard. This message is for people who are taking heavy steps. For those who are on the journey of faith and it feels heavy, I want you to walk together with me, with a man of faith who showed us what it's like to faithfully keep taking those heavy steps. In Genesis 22, verse 1, we see this. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here am I. And he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall tell you. So there's a lot in that text. I know we're familiar with it, so I'm going to slowly walk through this text because there's some meat in here. First off, we don't want to skip this phrase, but it says, after these things. So what are these things that it's after? Well, after an encounter with God, this man had an encounter with God that changed his name, changed his identity from a father to a father of many. He had an encounter with God that changed who he was forever. He had walked with God, seeing these promises and faithfulness of God over decades. He had been promised something wildly laughable at the time, that it was impossible when God said it. But then decades later, God fulfilled it. This was after this miraculous birth of his one legitimate son, happening at an impossibly wild time. When his wife, when Abraham's wife got pregnant when she was 90 years old. This is after experiencing a lifetime of God's provision, of faithfully walking with him in these progressively more difficult situations, but seeing God provide and protect at every step. So it's after these things that God gives Abraham a test. From our point of view, don't you think Abraham has graduated by now? Don't you think after 110, maybe 120 years of walking on the earth, most of them as an adult, him following God faithfully, don't you think this guy has earned a little bit of a retirement? How many of you know that in God's kingdom there is no retirement? With faith, if you are still alive, God is still figuring out ways and making plans to strengthen your faith and grow you in ways you didn't know you needed. Well, after all of these things, God, the creator of the universe, says this dude's name, reminds him of who he really is, father of many. Abraham had learned over these years that when God speaks and calls out your name, you answer, not just on a conditional basis, but the way he responds is the way we must learn to respond and say, here am I. Unconditionally, I'm here, I'm available to you in any way that you see fit. And Abraham opens himself up to this test by simply saying, here I am. He didn't know what was coming, but the test that God is about to give is a wildly uncomfortable, very uncomfortable test. He said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Excuse me? God wants what? When God asks for this, this isn't this vague idea. It's not a theoretical concept. This is a very personal, real test that God is saying, will you trust me with the thing that matters most to you? You need to know this, that the true tests of our faith is always going to be personal. God doesn't test Abraham with this theology exam or a multiple choice test. He tests him with Isaac, his joy, his future, his heart. But here's the truth. God will often ask us, you and I, to bring to him what is most precious to us. Not because he needs it, not because he wants to take it from us, not to harm us, but to show us how we will answer this question. Do you trust me with what you love? God even highlights how personal this test is. When he says it in this specific form, he says, take your son, your only son Isaac. Yeah, there was another son that Abraham had, but God had already told Abraham, let me take care of your other son. I will take care of him, let him go. I'll care for his mom and child and your child. But now this is the one that is going to get all of the blessing. This is the son, Isaac, the one whom I gave you in promise decades before. The one that you've believed in for so long, and I gave a miraculous birth. Take that miracle child. You know, the one you love. Interesting fact. This is the first time in all of Scripture, in 22 chapters of the whole Bible, that we see the word love show up. And it's about a father loving a son. Take this child that you love, that is precious to you. Offer him as a burnt sacrifice to me. Now, if you know anything about God, this should raise some flags for us. What we know about God is he desperately, passionately loves every single human being on the planet. He loves the preborn babies to the aged. He is designed each person with his fingerprints all over them, unique and precious, and every life is precious. So when we know this about God, we see this invitation of sacrifice. It doesn't make sense to us. But let me be clear. God is not asking this sacrifice of you and me. Not in the same way. This sacrifice, this request that God is giving to Abraham is very unique to Abraham. God is not asking us to sacrifice children. This was a very specific and unique test that God gave to Abraham, that he will never give or need to give any of us. So, if you think that you are supposed to sacrifice your child to God, that is not God. Just let's talk it through. That is not the case. But in ancient religions, child sacrifice was a common practice. All the other gods and all the other religions at the time required a child sacrifice to ensure future fertility. But the God of Abraham was different than all of the others, and Abraham knew that beyond a shadow of a doubt. Abraham had met God, Yahweh, decades before, and he had faithfully, though imperfectly, followed God since that point. Abraham knew God, knew his character, and walked with him. This test that God gave Abraham in this moment was deeply personal to Abraham's heart. And it challenged what other people said about other gods and what they're like. But more importantly, it challenged what Abraham knew about God. Though God will not ask us to literally sacrifice children, God will test our hearts in very personal ways. His tests will always force us to ask, do I love the gift more than the giver? Do I trust the one who gave it to me, even if he asks me to put it back in his hands? here's a principle for us to keep from this. That faith is measured by what we volunteer to entrust to God. It's one thing to endure what life throws at you, but it's another thing to voluntarily surrender what we love most simply because God asks. Voluntarily trusting something to God, especially what we love, is difficult. And how many of you know that not all sacrifice is the same? I would say that as I've been looking at things and praying about it, I see that there's three levels, for lack of a better word, levels of trust, of sacrifice that God may ask for us, from us. Number one is that circumstances will demand a sacrifice from us. This may look like just part of life being hard. When life blindsides you with hard stuff, and now you have to just sacrifice this and do it in a God-honoring way. Maybe you lose a job, maybe a relationship falls apart, a diagnosis comes in. You didn't choose it. In fact, you would try not to pay it if you didn't have to, but it still does cost you. The way that I see this kind of sacrifice is that it's a necessary tax of living in a world broken by sin. You can do that in such a way that it honors God. But then there's this other level of sacrifice that tests our faith. And it's when God commands us to sacrifice. In the Old Testament, God commanded sacrifices as a sign of what was going on in the heart. It was a measure of way that they could show that I am being obedient to my side of the story to the best of my ability, trusting that God will pay the ultimate penalty. But for us, God commands us to sacrifice a few things. This is simply just obeying, especially when you don't feel like it. This is when God says, "Thou shalt not steal," and you choose not to steal. This is when you forgive because God commands you to. This is when you entrust a sacrifice of 10% of your income simply because God invites us to. It's when you serve when you're tired. It's obeying because you're a child of God. Another way to say this is the kind of sacrifice that's like a bill that keeps the spiritual lights on in your heart. But then there's a third level. And this is the hardest level. And in fact, I think this is the level that God is inviting Abraham into in this moment. God will invite a sacrifice. When we read this in English, we don't see this nuance, but in Hebrew, the language that it was originally written in, there's a nuance in the verbiage. So when we see it, it's a command, take your son. But in the Hebrew, it sounds more like this, please, take your son. It's a request, it's an invitation. Not like commanding Abraham to go kill your child, but an offer to take an option. For us, when God invites a sacrifice from us, it's not one of those things that are absolutely necessary. But these are the kind of things where we take God up on an offer to experience more of him. It may not be for everyone else, but it may be what your heart needs. Fasting for us may not be required, but God offers us to connect with him in that way. God may not expect us to give more than 10%, but what if in our heart we say, I need to give more to release this to God? What about showing kindness to the ones that you're supposed to forgive and you really don't want to? Sometimes God invites us into these experiences of suffering, of sacrifices that are not absolutely necessary, but it's a way that we can invest in a valued relationship in such a way that over time makes life richer. This kind of sacrifice is the kind of sacrifice motivated by love, by affection and trust. You do it not because you have to or supposed to, but because he's simply just worth it. Let me ask you, in this season of life, what type of sacrifice are you offering to God right now? Is it the level of circumstance? Is it the level of, I need to work on following God's commands? Or is it that God is saying, in this specific personal area of your life, will you trust me? Whatever it is, each one of those opportunities is a test that invites us to grow in our faith and to trust God in a way we couldn't ever before. But I'll ask you, when you hear God inviting you to sacrifice, inviting you to be uncomfortable and to do the hard thing, how do you respond? Well, how did Abraham respond? The Bible calls him our father of the faith. In Hebrews, it points us towards looking at Abraham and seeing the way that he trusted God as a model for us. And so when God told him, take your beloved, one and only beloved son and offer him as a sacrifice, Abraham responded in this way. We see it in verse 3. It says, so Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. Keeps going on, and we'll read that in a second, but it says, here's my thinking here. Why didn't the Bible record what it would have recorded if I were in that position? If I were Abraham, I would have said, I'll obey if you explain. I'll obey if you promise to stop me before I actually do it. I'll obey if you tell me which mountain in this place, Moriah, that you're going to call me to. There was absolutely no discussion. Abraham simply wakes up and obeys. No delay, no drama, no social media poll to see if he was supposed to or not. He just takes the first step. But I gotta be honest. The way my brain works is, and when I make a to-do list of how to get things done, I break things down in a really annoying way. In fact, at the house, when we have chores, my wife and I have to make separate chore lists. Not because we're necessarily doing different things, but because if I don't write down every single step of the path there, I will forget what in the world I'm doing. If I have a requirement to do the dishes, you know what I have to write? Dishes out of the dishwasher. Dishes clean, dishes put in the dishwasher, dishes out of the, like that's how I have to say on my list. Because if I don't, I touch the dishes, it's done. Abraham here started the obedience. And there's a list of things that he does to accomplish those. And in my mind, every one of those steps is an opportunity for him to say, you know what, I changed my mind. Or he could go the easy route and make it easier on himself. Here's how I know this. It starts with him rising early in the morning. If you're not an early riser, that's a problem. But step number 2, saddled his donkey. Maybe you don't know this about Abraham, but Abraham was one of the wealthiest men in ancient Israel, ancient Canaan at the time. He had servants, hundreds, maybe thousands of servants. He had no reason to saddle his own donkey. And yet, he didn't choose the easy route of obedience. He chose to do the harder piece. He saddled his own donkey. Then he grabs 2 young men, servants. Then he takes his son. I'll keep reading. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Abraham gets started. The thing that God is calling him to do is wildly heavy. And it's got lots of steps to it. But what we see here is that faith starts with a step. Faith starts with a step. And honestly, so many of us get stuck here. Maybe we're waiting for all of the answers as to what God is going to call us to do next. Maybe we're waiting for things to change and waiting for things to get easier. I'll plan out the trip. I'll plan it out, and when I got all of my ducks in a row, then I will act on it. It's sometimes God is waiting on us to simply, in faith, take that first step. To be honest, on a faith journey, faith is rarely about having it all figured out. Faith begins by taking the first step and then trusting God will guide the rest of it. But here's a detail that I want us to settle into. I don't want us to skip this one, but it says not only did he saddle his own donkey, he cut the wood for the burnt offering. I don't know if you caught it, but earlier I told you that Abraham at this point in his history was anywhere between 110 to 120 years old. Who did the cutting? Abraham's a wealthy, elderly man. Elderly. And he chooses to pick up the axe himself and to cut the wood. Why is that important? God was asking him to sacrifice, to finish, to end Isaac's life. Abraham knew that was the end result. But every step along the way, he had to have his hands in the process of it. Sometimes I believe that faith isn't just about a moment, a big dramatic moment, but faith is about a process. Before Abraham ever took the knife into his hand and raised it against his son, Abraham lifted an axe and repeatedly over and over and over cut wood that he would use to burn his own son with. I could imagine before Abraham ever took one step into the wilderness towards the mountain, Abraham took up this heavy axe that got heavier every time he swung. With every swing, this axe got heavier, but the weight of what he was about to do must have gotten heavier. As he split the wood, his heart would have been splitting, thinking about having to sacrifice his beloved son. But he started in faith. And as it got harder, the more challenging his faith became. Faith begins with one step, but it is formed and strengthened in a process. God invites us to live lives of outrageous faith. Faith that changes the world around us. Faith that blesses generations to come after us. Faith that moves our hope from being centered in circumstances or possessions or people in relationships, but on to the unshakable character of God. But are we willing to keep cutting the wood when it gets hard and heavy? How faithful are we in the quiet preparation that nobody actually sees? Some of you are in this season of splitting wood. Maybe you wake up early, you pray, you read scriptures, but it feels dry. Maybe you keep showing up to serve, but it feels exhausting and you don't feel like anybody pays attention. Maybe you're giving, you're forgiving, you're loving, you're enduring, and it feels like nothing is changing. And in fact, this is only just the hard work before you have to do something even harder. Here's the story of faith. Don't quit. I know the process is exhausting. It's more than you want it to be. I know that you feel like you've been through it and you don't need to carry that weight anymore. But the process is the test. And the grind of that process is the proof that your faith is real, not to anyone else, but between you and God. Now, I know you know the rest of the story. If not, keep reading. But we'll come back to this next week. But the story doesn't start with glory. It starts with obedience, with tension, with heavy steps that get heavier as time goes on. But Abraham walked them anyway. Not because he knew the ending like we do, but because he had learned to trust the author in real life. That's what God is calling us to today. Maybe he's asking you to surrender something that's personally, deeply meaningful. Maybe he's asking you into this deeper level of sacrifice. Or maybe it's just to take the first step of faith. Or maybe it's to continue trusting him when the process is painful and slow and difficult. But here's the good news. You don't have to sprint in the journey of faith. You don't have to pretend that the swinging of the axe isn't hard or that you're good at it. You just have to start walking with him towards obedience. As the worship team comes up and we're getting ready to respond, I want us to remember this. That God tests our faith by asking us to take heavy steps, not to break us, but to strengthen us. So I'm going to ask that you would close your eyes and prepare yourself to respond. And here's what I'll ask you. What are you holding back because the cost feels so high? What first steps are you avoiding because you don't really know the full map? What wood are you supposed to keep on cutting even though you're tired? Some of you may be in this room and you have yet to say yes to Jesus for the first time. You don't know the whole story, but I'll tell it to you. The reality is you cannot do enough to fix what is broken in your heart and in your soul. But Jesus died on the cross. He sacrificed himself in your place so that you could be made right with God. The first step of faith is simply accepting that reality, that Jesus did enough. And submitting yourself to that reality. In a moment, I'm going to ask that we're going to sing and we're going to pray. And when we do so, I'm going to be down here at the front with one of the elders, and I want to talk with you about absolutely anything. But especially if God is putting on your heart this calling and saying, I don't get the whole picture, but I want to follow Jesus for the first time. Don't delay. Don't negotiate. Do what Abraham said. And he said, here am I. Would you respond?